What defines a good teacher? Teachers are a cut above the rest. They inspire us. They show us the opportunities of experiments, to question, to test, to be creative. Regarding the many multicultural classrooms of today, students of different diverse backgrounds depend ever more on the positive role teachers provide to ensuring a democratic education that is both fair and equitable. Of the many intellectual thinkers of the past century, John Dewey stands at the forefront for positive changes to public education. He believed that education is the fundamental method of social progress and reform. As a proponent of social psychology and founder of functional psychology, Dewey was the leading voice for progressive education that is a foundation for multiculturalism within education reform. Dewey's theories linked the individual to community, inquiry and reflection processes to action, and personal ethical decisions to social intelligence and democracy. No one was more of an intellectual activist from the 19th century whose body of work is still apparent within today's educational goals than John Dewey. Born in 1859 on October 20th in Burlington, Vermont, he was the third son of four. His mother was a devout Calvinist, and his father left the grocery business to become a Union Army soldier in the Civil War. Dewey was born 1 year before Lincoln was elected president, 6 years before he was assassinated, 7 years before the end of the Civil War, 14 before the creation of blue jeans, 33 years before the invention of basketball. He passed away a decade before the first Walmart. He attended Burlington Public Schools until the age of 15, when he enrolled at the University of Vermont, and he graduated 4 years later, second in his class. He taught for a couple years in Pennsylvania and Vermont. Then he took a break from teaching and entered Johns Hopkins University, receiving his PhD in philosophy and psychology. He became assistant professor at the University of Michigan, where he taught for nearly a decade. There he met his wife, Harriet Alice Chipman. They married in 1886. In 1894, he became chairman of the Department of Philosophy, Psychology, and Pedagogy at the University of Chicago. He was elected president of the American Psychological Association in 1899 and president of the American Philosophical Association in 1905. At which point he joined the Ivy League and became professor of philosophy at Columbia University, where he taught until he retired in 1929. During his tenure at Columbia, he traveled to China and was inspired by the student demonstrations on May 4th. He stayed in China for 2 years and gave over 200 lectures on progressive education and modern Western values. When the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed on October 29, 1923, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the first Turkish president, invited John Dewey into the country as an education consultant. Atatürk recognized the need for public culture, which would enable students to participate fully in public life, and saw that the unification of modernization and education was the key. Dewey stayed for 2 months in Turkey and reported his observations to the Ministry of Education. Time magazine chose Dewey for their cover of June 4, 1928, and after his death, Dewey was acknowledged for his impact on society with a commemorative postage stamp displaying his image in 1965. During his lifetime, he published nearly 40 books and wrote hundreds of articles and reports during his long career. He is recognized as a philosopher, educational innovator, and psychologist who greatly influenced social and education reform. I'd like to go over with you the moral principles in education that John Dewey writes about, which he published in 1909. Within the book, John Dewey explains the moral purpose of school is built around the idea that there are moral ideas and there are ideas about morality. The business of the educator for John Dewey is to see to it that the greatest possible number of ideas acquired by children and youth are acquired in such a vital way that they become moving ideas. They become motive forces in the guidance of conduct. Now, teachers are constantly teaching about morals, no matter if it's specifically scheduled in the curriculum, such as a class on ethics. But unfortunately, because of their own character or their school atmosphere, or their ideals or their methods of teaching, or even the subject matter which they teach, they're not in detail as to bring intellectual results into vital union with character, so that they become working forces in behavior. Dewey believes there cannot be two sets of ethical principles, one for life in the school and the other for life outside of the school. He feels that the moral responsibility of the school and those who conduct it is to society. In sum, for John Dewey, the school is fundamentally an institution erected by society to do a certain specific work, to exercise a specific function in maintaining the life and advancing the welfare of society. Well, within the school, there's the moral training given by the school community. There's the unity of social ethics and school ethics. Now, the social value and moral worth and work of the public school system is often limited in a specific way. It's limited to training for citizenship, and citizenship means a narrow concept, voting, obeying laws. Well, John Dewey is certain upon this specific belief that the school life should train for many social relations. He speaks about the child. The child, for him, is an organic whole. It's an intellectually, socially, morally, as well as physically whole being. And the school must take the child as a member of society in the broadest sense and demand for and from that child whatever is necessary to enable it to intelligently recognize all his social relations and take part in sustaining them. It should train for self-direction and for leadership, because the child's going to be a voter, a subject of law, a member of family, a worker, a member of a community, a neighborhood, in sum, a contributor to life. And training needs to be in all categories, science, art, history, but specifically, there needs to be a command of fundamental methods of inquiry and tools for communication, because they need to be habits of serviceability. Now, there's a harmonious development of powers apart from social situations. And this is where he gets really philosophical. So hang on tightly. I'll try to go slow, but it gets heavier on. The society of the child is, according to John Dewey, the United States, and it's a democratic and it's a progressive society. So the child must be educated for leadership, obedience, power of self-direction, power to administer, to assume responsibilities, yada yada.
Yada, yada, yada.
But apart from this, there's also a participation in social life. And Dewey claims that in the school has no moral end nor aim. And he finds that flawed severely. So, for him, school activities should be typical of social life. Now, the end of education is to be the harmonious development of all the powers of the individual. But the simple fact is that there is no isolated faculty of observation or memory or reasoning, because faculties simply mean the particular impulse and habits have been coordinated or framed with reference to accomplishing certain definite kinds of work. Now, we need to know the social situations in which these individuals have to use the ability to observe, recollect, imagine, reason, in order to be able to tell what training of mental powers actually means. So the school cannot be a preparation for social life unless it reproduces within itself typical conditions of social life. And the only way to prepare for social life is to engage in social life. Too often, John Dewey says, the teachers are concerned with the moral life of pupils, and it takes the form of alertness for failures to conform to school rules and routine. And these rules are more or less conventional and arbitrary. And the child, for John Dewey, needs to have a positive consciousness of what he's about to do, so he can judge his acts from the standpoint of reference to the work which he has to do. So here John Dewey describes the moral habits of the school, and he says that the child needs to have the same motives for right doing and be judged by the same standards in the school as the adult in the wider social life, such as interest in community, interest both intellectually, practically, even emotionally. Well, he proposes a solution to cultivate the social spirit within the school. And this idea, which is very common now, was revolutionary to education at the beginning of the 20th century. And that emphasis on this idea falls upon construction and giving out, rather than absorption and mere learning. Now there's the moral training from methods of instruction, which is an active social service opposed to a passive individual absorption. So some stimulus must be found to keep the child at his studies. And at best, that'll be affection for the teacher, together with the feeling that the kid's not violating school rules and also contributing to the good of the school. But for John Dewey, he says these are selfish in quality, because the child will eventually maybe grow out of these and understand an appreciation of larger relations to life. So he says that along with these qualities, there's an egotistical motive that can sometimes come out. There's fear. Fear enters a lot into education. Fear, not just physical, but fear of punishment, fear of losing the approbation of others, the fear of failure. And then on the other side, there's emulation and rivalry. Children are judged with reference to their capacity to realize the same external standard. The weaker gradually lose their sense of power and accept a position of continuous and persistent inferiority. And even the strong, they learn to glory, but not in their strength, but according to John Dewey, in the fact that they are stronger. So he stresses the importance in this chapter of every method that appeals to the child's active powers, to his capacities in construction, production, creation. And now we hear this as the key to successful teaching in all our courses on teaching. Dewey was the voice that brought this idea into the classroom more than a century ago. And this method, founded in morals, marks an opportunity to shift the center of ethical gravity from an absorption, which is selfish, to a service, which is social. But even now, in classrooms across America, just like in John Dewey's time, there was a separation between instruction and character. And this continues because within the schools, there's a divorce between learning and doing. Well, John Dewey proposes a method to solve that, and he speaks about the social nature. And in this chapter, he talks really about pedagogy. And his philosophy are real kernels of truth that are relevant to multiculturalism and the diverse classrooms that populate America. He says it's the subject matter used in school life which decides the general atmosphere of the school and the methods of instruction and discipline which rule it. I quote, "A study is to be considered as a means of bringing the child to realize the social scene of action." So at present, according to him, there's three independent values that are involved in bringing this study. There's culture, information, and discipline. Now, information is genuine or educative only insofar as it presents definite images and conceptions of materials placed in a context of social life. Like I said, it gets very philosophical. The discipline is genuinely educative only as it represents a reaction of information into the individual's own powers so that he brings them under control for social ends. She brings them. John Dewey always wrote with the male pronoun. Now, culture for John Dewey is to be genuinely educative and not an external polish or fictitious varnish. And for him, it represents the vital union of information and discipline within the student. So, the socialization of the individual depends on his outlook upon life. But because education is so pigeonholed in its classification of materials and things are confined to different textbooks, that they separate the idea they all have to do with the same conscious experience of living on earth. So when a study is taught as a mode of understanding social life, it has positive ethical import. And this demands for social intelligence, social power, and social interest, which John Dewey calls the moral trinity of the school. And multiculturalism, like progressive education, is the demand for social intelligence, social power, and social interest. So John Dewey says that there are resources found in 3 places for this to occur: the life of the school as a social institution, methods of learning and of doing, and the school studies or curriculum. Well, he concludes his argument with the psychological aspect of moral education. And he affirms that a consideration of conduct as a mode of individual performance, personal doing, takes us from the social to the psychological side of morals. He says that all conduct springs ultimately out of our native instincts and impulses. And the psychological side of education sums itself up in the consideration of a human's character. Now, the individual must have the power to stand up and count for something in the actual conflicts of life. They must have initiative, insistence, persistence, courage, industry. In some, they must have a force of character. Now, with multiculturalism, this means defending diversity, combating racism, tolerance. Well, Dewey, he dives deeper into the essence of this moral stipulation. Now, within this force of character, there is not a guarantee for the right end. An example can be mischievous boys. They can have an efficiency that can be directed towards mistaken ends, and that can result in positive mischief and destruction. So he says that power must be directed. It must be organized along social channels, and it must be attached to valuable ends within education. Well, how do you achieve this? Well, it involves training on both the intellectual and emotional side. Intellectual, what does that mean? You must have good judgment. You gotta have common sense. Well, the difference between mere knowledge or information and judgment is that the former is simply held and it's not used. Judgment is knowledge directed with the reference to the accomplishment of ends. Judgment is knowledge directed with reference to the accomplishment of ends. So good judgment is a sense of respected values. He says that the consciousness of ends, they must be more than merely intellectual. So there's an importance of intellectual judgment, and we can imagine a person with most excellent judgment, but who doesn't act upon his judgment? So that's why there must not only be force to ensure effort in execution against obstacles, such as racism, such as ignorance, but there must also be a delicate personal responsiveness. There must be an emotional response. And good judgment is impossible without this susceptibility. So at the beginning of the 20th century, John Dewey published this book, and he asked some very important questions. Does the school, as a system at present, attach sufficient importance to the spontaneous instincts and impulses of the student? Does it afford sufficient opportunity for these to assert themselves and work out their own results? Does the school attach itself to the active constructive powers rather than to processes of absorption and learning? Does the schoolwork afford conditions for the formation of good judgment? The greatest defect of instruction today on the intellectual side is found in the fact that children leave school without a mental perspective. The facts, they seem all the same to them, regarding all the same importance. The child cannot get power of judgment unless they continually exercise and are given the opportunity to form and test their judgments. The child must have an opportunity to select for themselves and to attempt this and put this selection into execution so that they may see the final test, which is action. then can they learn to discriminate what promises success from that which promises failure. Howard wrote in the book we read in class about the 4 key steps to multiculturalism: empathy, honesty, advocacy, action. It all ends with action. So we need to translate the moral into the conditions and forces of our community life. And they need to be translated into the impulses and habits of the individual. So the teacher who operates in this faith will find every subject, every method of instruction, every incident of school pregnant with moral possibility. And that are the moral principles in education.
But I want to know. I want to know. There's golden rays of sun shining off the water. And there's voices in my head.